In part 6 of Why Was the Third Earliest Party in the United States Opposed to Freemasonry? We're going to discuss the 1828 presidential election, the continuation of the Morgan trials, and John Quincy Adams becoming an anti-Mason. If you haven't already seen parts 1 through 5, you should do that now and come back here later. Look for the links at the top of this page. If you've already seen parts 1 through 5, welcome back to my channel where I question history as we know it. Thank you so much for being here, and you can support me further by liking this video and subscribing if you haven't already. When it comes to the 1828 presidential election, New York anti-Masons were mostly uninvolved, other than the fragile alliance made between the John Quincy Adams Party and Thurlow Weed. William Seward, then supporting Adams, helped some local anti-Masons write their speeches. Weed and Seward had met 4 years prior when Seward was involved in a stagecoach accident in Rochester. It just so happened that Thurlow Weed was one of the men that came to his aid. Both being politically minded and both anti-Andrew Jackson, they had become fast friends. It wouldn't be long before Seward would make the transition to anti-Masonry. While campaigning for the election, John Quincy Adams declared that he was not, never was, and never will be a Mason. While in contrast, his running mate, Andrew Jackson, was the Grand Master of the Tennessee Lodge, and was quoted as saying, "Freemasonry is an institution whose object is the welfare of mankind, and I am convinced that it will flourish in the future." Despite many of the anti-Masonic sentiments at this time, this did not prevent Jackson from being elected as our 7th president in that year, with the help of Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren was then the leader of a large political group called the Albany Regency, a term supposedly coined by Thurlow Weed. Van Buren was called the Little Magician or the Sly Fox, depending on which side you were rooting for. He is credited as one of the founding fathers of our two-party system and the Democratic Party. This political machine he had been organizing was the precursor to our modern systems. Having dominated New York politics since 1822, this group, which was originally called the Holy Alliance, was formed together through the spoils system. And as you probably know, the spoils system is the practice of a successful political party giving public office to its supporters, friends, and relatives. Van Buren, being the sly fox that he was, had been cleverly handing out government positions in order to secure votes. Through this system, he was able to assist Andrew Jackson in securing the vote for president, and he himself the governor of New York. Since we know that Masons held a disproportionate number of government positions in New York during 1826, and Andrew Jackson was the Grand Master of Tennessee, I don't believe I'm going out on a limb here to ask the question of whether or not Martin Van Buren was a Freemason himself, or suggest that he most likely was one. I have yet to find an answer on this, and I'm very curious to hear your opinion, so please comment below to let me know. In any case, as 1829 rolled in, New York anti-Masons celebrated their successes of the 1828 elections, having become its own third political party in the United States, while the Adams organization, having suffered a great defeat, continued to decline. We directed a statewide anti-Masonic convention in Albany on February 19th. Solomon Southwick delivered the opening speech, while Weed and his associates also actively participated. It would seem to an outsider as a reconciliation between the purists and the realists. Weed's speech emphasized the beginnings of the movement, select political victories, as well as the power of public opinion being upheld through the ballot boxes. Plans were made for a national anti-Masonic convention to select candidates, and a date was set for September 11th, 1830. This date being significant since it would be the 4-year anniversary of Morgan's abduction. Also, side note, I wonder if this date was significant to the Masons as well, or if there was a particular reason this date was chosen to abduct Morgan. I'm not sure. I didn't do any additional research on this, and I might sound like a super conspiracy theorist. But, 9/11, it's kind of weird, right? Let me know what you think in the comments. Okay, back to the story. Unfortunately for Weed, some anti-Masonic newspapers criticized and accused him of turning anti-Masonry into a movement with the real goal of bringing down the Jackson Party. The purists felt that the focus needed to be on increasing representation in the General Assembly before worrying about presidential politics. Meanwhile, President Jackson had written to the newly elected governor of New York, Martin Van Buren, to ask him to become his Secretary of State. On March 5th of 1829, Van Buren resigned as governor to take this new position beside the president, having served the shortest term as governor in New York history, 43 days. This left the governor role up to Enos Thurlow, then the lieutenant governor, and if you recall, had been the judge of the first Morgan trials against Nicholas Chesborough, Lowton Lawson, Edward Sawyer, and John Sheldon. In another change of hands, Daniel Moseley, the special agent now in charge of the Morgan investigations, is appointed as a circuit judge in March. He's replaced by John Spencer, who, if you recall, was one of the defense lawyers for the Masons in the first case. And randomly, or not, it turns out that he was also DeWitt Clinton's brother-in-law. Is it a small world, a conspiracy, or just a plain coincidence? I don't know. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Anyway, according to Weed, Spencer wished to obtain Orson Parkhurst, one of the drivers of the carriage's testimony, as he believed that Parkhurst would have been able to identify several persons who were involved in Morgan's abduction. It appears in another instance of Weed playing the part of a detective/bounty hunter, he was involved in finding of this necessary witness. Weed claimed that members of the fraternity followed him on his journey, and that it took several days to throw them off and reach his destination. When found, Parkhurst agreed to travel back with Weed, and after they had been riding for long enough that Orson's eyes had become affected by the dust, Weed decided to take the canal boat for the rest of the journey. Thurlow says he was hyper-vigilant about knowing what passengers got on and off the boat, but at some point, he sees that Orson is asleep, and he decides to finally do the same. After 3 hours, Weed awoke only to find his witness missing completely. Although Parkhurst was not present, many other witnesses were called to Rochester for testimony. Among these was Isaac Allen, who refused to answer questions being asked of him on the grounds that answering would implicate himself. Arguments between the special attorney and the counsel for Allen were made before the court, and it was established that Allen should answer the questions. He continued to refuse, however, and so he was committed to jail, but only for a few days, and afterwards was discharged with the consent of the prosecuting officers. At least 8 other witnesses, or conspirators, had also left town like Parkhurst, attempting to escape justice. Burge Smith, William King, and John Whitney all fled to southern states for a time, with only one of them eventually being tried. Smith died in New Orleans, not having been found. William King had left his family in Niagara, and after returning to them, he learned that Eli Bruce had testified that he had accompanied him in the carriage which had held Morgan and had crossed the Niagara River with him. King died suddenly after, it was said from an angry fit. John Whitney had also returned at his leisure and then was tried. He was found guilty and sentenced to 1 year in the county jail. On February 25, 1830, the New York Anti-Masons held their first convention of the year in Albany. Delegates prepared a statement of facts accusing the Grand Lodge of New York of providing funds to help the Morgan conspirators. 36 representatives were selected to attend the National Convention planned, including Albert Tracy, Francis Granger, and William Seward. With the help of Seward and others, Thurlow Weed relocated to Albany to establish a new leading anti-Masonic paper called the Albany Evening Journal. This publication quickly became the official mouthpiece of the Anti-Masonic Party in New York. Weed was advised by one of his financiers to be moderate in his editorials in order to introduce readers to anti-Masonry, quote, by degrees, pun intended. It was by this time that William Seward had left the Adams Party and become an active anti-Mason. He spoke at a convention held in his native county, denouncing Freemasonry as a secret government, enacting and enforcing its own laws, including executing the death penalty. With Seward as candidate and Weed in charge of the leading paper, the political duo appealed to the working class, advocating for reform of the militia system, abolishment of imprisonment for debt, and preventing the seizure of workers' tools for non-payment of debt. Strangely, few of Seward's published speeches that have survived touch on Freemasonry or anti-Masonry. According to Thurlow's autobiography, John Spencer had been known to be opposed to political anti-Masonry originally. However, after having first-hand knowledge of the ways in which so many Masons were able to elude justice, before his first year as special counsel expired, he had changed his mind and become an anti-Mason himself. For reasons unknown, or at least to me, it was around this time that the governor and legislator were seemingly dissatisfied with Mr. Spencer and chose to cut his salary down considerably. In May of 1830, Spencer responded with an angry letter in which he stated the objects of his appointment and that instead of being supported by the government, he had been constantly embarrassed and frequently thwarted in his efforts to discover, arraign, and convict persons who had violated laws. He even alleged that his, quote, confidential communications to the executive, under whose authority he acted, had been disclosed so as to reach the counsel for the accused and enabled them to paralyze his exertions. For these reasons, Spencer stated that he could not with any self-respect continue to hold the office and thereby resigned. Victory Birdseye was appointed to fill the position. I didn't find any additional information on this character, only that he was not a Mason or an anti-Mason, though he was opposed to political anti-Masonry. It just so happens. If anybody else knows anything about this character, please let me know in the comments. I, for one, can understand Spencer's frustration after having read in detail how most of these trials went. The amount of blatant refusal for answering simple questions is enough to drive a person mad. Take, for instance, the June 1830 trial of Ezekiel Jewett, an ex-Army officer. In this case, the attempt was made to prove that Jewett was in charge of Fort Niagara while Morgan was being held there against his will. Unfortunately, the prosecution was unable to obtain direct proof of this, even though it was obvious that the witnesses were not telling the whole truth at all. The first witness called, Orsimus Turner, refused to answer several questions on the grounds that he would be, you guessed it, incriminating himself. He was found in contempt of court and sentenced to 60 days in the county jail and a fine of $250. Eli Bruce was then called, but refused to be sworn, stating that he had done it before and no good had come of it. He was sentenced to 30 more days in the jail from which he had brought in to testify. Some accounts state that this sentence was never actually served, though, on account of his, quote, feeble health. To be fair, he does end up dying only a year after being released on September 24th, 1832, being only 39. John Whitney was the next to be called, and he too refused to be sworn, and so the court sentenced him a fine of $250 and 30 days imprisonment. The trial only lasted 6 days, and displays such as this continued throughout the Jewett case so that no evidence had been given showing that he was connected in any way to the Morgan disappearance. No one saw Jewett and Morgan together, and no one admitted that it was in fact Morgan being held in the magazine. The jury was only out for 15 minutes and returned with a verdict of not guilty. The trials concerning the abduction of Morgan only served to encourage anti-Masonry further. The most notable politician to affiliate themselves with anti-Masonry is John Quincy Adams. As previously mentioned, he was president when Morgan was kidnapped, and Congress, after arguing about how to handle the memorial the Morgan committees had written about Fort Niagara and Morgan, decided to bring the issue to him directly. However, nothing came of this, and overall, Adams had remained publicly neutral on the subject until after 1828. Historian William Preston Vaughan in the Anti-Masonic Party states that John Quincy's personal disapproval of the institution originated with his father, John Adams, who had passed away in July of 1826. On a number of occasions, John Quincy had to address whether or not he or his father were Freemasons. Hence the aforementioned comment that he was not, never was, or never will be a Mason. Obviously, the fact that he lost the 1828 presidential election to Freemason Andrew Jackson increased his hostility towards the fraternity. He found it concerning that presumably about 3/4 of all public offices were held by Masons at that time. He noted in one of his letters that one of the most interesting things about the organization was its influence and the promotion of its members into places of power. He was disgusted by the oaths, obligations, and penalties used by the Masons, suggesting that these influence and control the members and not to the benefit of the rest of the community. In 1830, John Quincy Adams was elected to the House of Representatives on an anti-Masonic ticket, and in May of 1831, he attended an anti-Masonic state convention in Massachusetts. By December of that year, when he took his seat in the House, he was a fully committed anti-Mason, one of 18 in the chamber at that time. Below, you will find free digital copies of Thurlow Weed's Autobiography and the Anti-Masonic Party, or you can find Amazon links to purchase those books if you just love to feel the book in your hand like I do. And there's the added bonus of me earning commission off of that. And part 7 coming up next.